So the first question actually is from Muriel. So I'm going to read the question because I know we're recording this, and so those who are listening to this in the future may not have an opportunity to hear the question or to see the question in the chat. But the question is, when you talk about sexual violence perpetrated by soldiers, from example, the UN peacekeeping forces, what impact does the fact that those are mostly male soldiers, and would you say it would be a different matter if there were more women also involved in those forces? Well, that's a great question, Muriel. And so this is a question about how you gender balance a military force that is there for the function of peacekeeping. And indeed, if we look at the Women, Peace and Security agenda and apply that gender perspective, we indeed do look at how we gender balance forces in peacekeeping operations. And so it is a fundamental consideration of the United Nations and of NATO when it comes to looking at how it structures its forces and deploys its forces into the field, that it does have representation from women, and not just token representation from women, but actual representation from women in leadership roles and representation from women throughout the chain of command. This is fundamental. So that for both the context of gender equality and the advancement of women within a traditionally male-dominated vocation, but also more broadly than that, it is also fundamental because it does lead to a greater understanding of how the impact of armed conflict can affect women, in particular in a conflict zone. So in that context, there you look at things like female engagement teams. So a female engagement team, or a FET, it was particularly used in Afghanistan and has also been used in Iraq in the context of NATO forces and coalition forces. Female engagement teams are designed to be able to move out into communities and to be able to engage with local women in environments where it may be difficult for male soldiers who are patrolling through local villages and townships to be able to engage with women based upon the cultural and gender norms that exist in the nation in which they're operating. And so female engagement teams are a vital part of that, and indeed have realised success in a number of different operational environments. And I've worked alongside of female engagement teams, and I think that's also they do some fundamentally good work. When it comes to leadership positions, I think that's also a fundamental thing to think about as well. If we look to the NATO mission in Iraq at the moment, that is led by a Canadian general, and she's doing a fantastic job in that particular role in the NATO mission in Iraq, as I said. If we look at the UN mission at the moment in Cyprus, that's being led by an Australian general, and again, she is doing a fabulous job there. But throughout chains of command, absolutely, there is a necessity there to be able to try and look at balancing your forces, and balancing them for the sake not only of operational effects, so the idea that you can have a better effect on the ground, you can better understand the operating environment, but also, as I said, to drive towards the ultimate goal of gender equality as well. So the two need to be inherently linked. Quite often, militaries will think about operational effects, particularly at a tactical level and even at an operational level, but certainly at a strategic level and at a national political strategic level, issues about gender equality and the balance of forces is key considerations. If you look to the National Action Plan for Sweden for Women, Peace and Security, or you look to the National Action Plan for Australia for Women, Peace and Security, you will actually see there where there are indeed, as part of the plans, intentions there to improve or to recruit further women into security roles, both in the military and in policing, indeed to achieve that effect. So that's one aspect there. I think what I'm going to do is also just touch on another aspect that's important that links to the Women, Peace and Security agenda and deals with sexual violence as well, and that is also gender advisors and gender focal points within organisations, peacekeeping organisations and coalition forces. So gender advisors in the context of a military organisation are those that are responsible for the integration of a gender perspective into military operational planning, and into the execution of military tasks. And gender focal points exist then at the tactical level to indeed do the same thing at the tactical level. So for tactical planning and the tactical execution of tasks. And what these individuals do is they're specially trained. There is indeed the Nordic Centre for Gender and Military Operations in Sweden, for example, and there are a number of other nations, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, to the other nations that I can think of off the top of my head, that run either NATO accredited or UN accredited training that qualifies people to be gender advisors and gender focal points. And this training is fundamental, and indeed the positioning or the use of gender advisors or the employment of gender advisors within forces is fundamental to the integration of that gender perspective, to be able to understand how military actions are going to impact upon the civilian population, but not just to understand the civilian population as a whole, but to break it down based upon sex disaggregated data, how the impacts will be felt in terms of men, in terms of women, boys and girls, to better inform decision making from a military perspective, and to better inform decision making more broadly from an overall intent to achieve peace. So that is certainly something there. And then what we're looking at then is the idea of then ultimately achieving gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming being that the perspective doesn't necessarily need to be vested in one person, because everybody understands the importance of that perspective. But certainly that's the other way in which you would put I would put to you that indeed peacekeeping forces look to address such issues. And again, also as well, the last thing would be also training of those forces. So it's all well and good to have a zero tolerance policy on sexual exploitation and sexual abuse, but it's another thing to actually train the forces that are being committed by various nations, and to ensure they understand what that really means and that they're able to affect that in their own chain of command. So there are indeed programs that are being put in, that are in place and that are being further developed in both the United Nations and also in NATO to indeed train troop contributing nations and their forces in the zero tolerance policy of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. So that's probably the final comment about that particular question, Muriel. Okay, we've got another question here from Martine, and she said, in the example that you gave at the beginning, there seemed to be a deliberateness to the actions of soldiers, that rapes seem strategic rather than impulsive. What do the military think to achieve by committing rape rather than killing it all? Okay, that's a good question. So when we think about defining conflict-related sexual violence, we do think about it in the context of achieving a military or political objective. How does it achieve an objective rather than, say, just killing somebody? Well, first of all, I'd put to you that we're in terms of you targeting someone for sexual violence, it's important to look at what sort of person what people are being targeted. It's important to understand that the people that are being targeted are either going to be civilians who are not directly participating in an armed conflict, or who are no longer participating in the armed conflict, or indeed combatants who are no longer participating. So in that context, killing an individual is a war crime in that context, as is raping that individual. But the idea of rape is about instilling fear, is about creating an environment in which people are afraid, is about terrorising, and is also about potentially causing harm across multiple generations. So, for example, in the example I gave where I talked about Mary and I talked about her husband and her 2 sons being killed, and then her daughter being raped in front of her, and then indeed she was being raped herself, the effects that rape will have on her certainly will be multi-generational as well, and will continue this and that can be potentially a reason why it's used as a strategy. It can displace people. So if you, as I mentioned, if you displace people, then they are less productive. And it's not necessarily that those who are rape-based, those who are about the rape of others, choose or then displaced out of their homes or choose to leave. So that they become that affects the society. So yes, if you kill one individual, that individual is dead, and everyone who obviously chooses to rape. But you think about it that way in which which sexual violence is used. I would also say as well that it's not necessarily just a zero-sum game insofar as you're either going to be raped or killed. You may indeed be raped and then be killed as well. So there is those sorts of things there that do occur. I'm sorry if it's sort of hard in this context where you kind of don't get a little bit of too much feedback to know if I'm hitting the mark and answering your question. But I hope Martina, I hope I've given some sort of answer to the question now. But certainly as well, rape can be impulsive. So when I talked about the idea of rape being used as when there's a breakdown in society, and when indeed society is no longer functioning, and a breakdown in chain of command, they can be impulsive acts as well. Okay. In terms of the next question is from Lucy, and she asks, most times when talking about rape, people tend to assume that it's a woman getting raped, and unfortunately, I have friends who still do not believe that they, being males, would ever get raped. Does this also happen within war zones? That sexual violence is also perpetrated on boys and males in general? And does it get hushed up more since the religious upbringing or the general mindset of nations isn't necessarily as accepting of LGBTIQ plus peoples? Yeah. Lucy, that's a great question. Look, I'll answer it in two ways. The first way would be that for anyone who is coming from a military background, who has ever undertaken conduct after capture training, or what is also can be known as survival, resistance, evasion training, and so on and so forth, effectively getting captured by an enemy. Anyone who's undertaken that training will understand as a male that it is likely that you will be subjected to an act of sexual violence upon capture by an enemy. And certainly in the context of, say, Afghanistan, or in the context of fighting in Iraq to defeat Daesh, it was pretty well understood that if you were to be captured by Taliban, Haqqani, or Daesh, that you would likely be subjected to sexual violence. You think to yourself, why would that be? What possible use does that have? If you think about it in the context, and Lucy kind of pointed to it and talks about how it's sort of hushed up and perhaps a taboo subject. Take a military male from a Western nation who's a fighting age male who's an alpha type personality, who has that mindset about them. Subject them to an act of sexual violence and strip away their humanity as a means of control and a means in which you can then exploit their vulnerabilities when it comes to interrogation and indeed just holding them, would be a way in which sexual violence could be used in that context. I think it's okay for me to say that if a male is going to be raped and anally raped, there is a likelihood that the prostrate will cause that male to indeed achieve an erection and perhaps an ejaculation. So if that was to happen in the context, say, for example, if I was to be captured and I was to be subjected to an act of sexual violence in that context, it may cause that particular alpha male to really reflect upon what it is about their sexuality and so on and so forth. It breaks down their own sense of self, I suppose. And so in that context, it's fairly well understood that that may indeed be a consequence of being captured. And indeed, when we talk about conduct after capture training, we do look to that. In the context of sexual violence generally against boys and males, there is, men and boys, there obviously it obviously does occur, it's certainly I mentioned earlier reporting coming out of detention facilities in Syria that talk to sexual violence against males or men and boys. I also would point to, in particular, when you're talking about child soldiers and when you're talking about kidnapping child soldiers or kidnapping children from villages and subsuming them into your armed group and subjecting them to sexual violence as a means of control again, and as a means of making sure that they're unwilling or unlikely to return to the families that you've torn them from. That would be a means of control. I don't know if it gets hushed up more. I think what I would say is that sexual violence is a taboo subject. It's pretty much universally a taboo subject, and certainly in the context of some of the locations where sexual violence is perpetrated in current conflicts, it is significantly taboo, and it may mean that both acts against women and indeed against girls that also go unreported. But I think it is important to note that yes, applying a gender perspective, looking at the women, peace and security agenda, we would consider acts against boys and against men as much as we would against women and girls. The statistics just show that disproportionately it's men who are perpetrators and it's women and girls who are victims. That said, though, women are also capable of being perpetrators as well. And indeed, if you look at Daesh and you look at some of the women who were involved in Daesh, who were protagonists in that organisation, who are involved in the facilitation and sale of Yazidi women in particular into sexual slavery, they were indeed Daesh women. So women are capable in that respect of being involved in, at least in, if not the physical act of sexual violence, indeed in facilitating the sexual violence or encouraging it as well. So, it's unfortunately it's a really complex question because there are so many layers and so many different answers you can possibly give, and I can't really, other than giving you sort of a broad brush answer like that, I can't really do it justice, because every single instance of a conflict, and even within a conflict, is so nuanced, and that's what really makes that's what really draws out the value of people like gender advisors in a military organisation and gender focal points, who can look at that sex disaggregated data and who can consider those impacts, in particular, so that they can then draw that into operational planning, into the execution of tasks. Does it get hushed up? Absolutely. Does it get hushed up anymore? I don't know. I don't have any figures on that. So I wouldn't want to, commit to anything in particular. Okay, so I'll get the next question here is, can I recommend institutions or NGOs that work with sexual violence in armed conflicts regarding internships? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Everything from the ICRC looks at working with issues of sexual violence, and indeed will put out information with respect to that. And obviously, they offer internships. UN Women will deal with sexual violence in the context of armed conflict and sexual violence and gender-based violence more broadly, and offer internships. Save the Children are also involved in issues of gender-based violence and sexual violence, both in the context of conflicts but also outside of conflict zones, that offer internships. What I will do for that question is I'll have a bit more of a think about that, and I'll also consult with some other colleagues as well, and draw some of that information and then provide it through to Muriel, and she can also put that into the Facebook page as well if there's any other particular NGOs or institutions that work with sexual violence that offer internships. But I can pretty much say if you were to do a Google search and look at NGOs, there is indeed a lot. I mean, there's indeed, and it also depends upon which area as well, which country you're looking to do an internship in, because there are in Southeast Asia there are institutions that look at, in particular, sexual violence against children and the trafficking of children, the sale of them into sexual slavery or sexual services. It links to sexual violence and indeed links to issues of conflict, particularly the trafficking of people out of, say, Myanmar or other parts of Thailand where conflict is occurring. So there are NGOs that relate to that as well. So it really, I'll put together some thoughts on some NGOs and institutions and pop them through to Muriel to answer that question about that. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause for a second because we're going to unlock the poll that Muriel mentioned at the beginning of this lecture.
Yeah, I don't want to disturb anything. It's just people tend to leave at the end sometimes. So before you do that, please just quickly fill in the poll. It would help us quite a lot to try to improve and develop our work. I'll just try. I think it should work. So it should pop up on your screen and you can take all the time you want to answer it, just that you before you have to leave for dinner or something, please quickly fill it out. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, the next question is a question from Ula, and the question is there a plan for when conflict is over? So a way to rehabilitate victims. We don't want generations of suffering. Has the UN got plans for this? Absolutely. So in terms of demobilisation, disarmament and reintegration of peoples, there is absolutely considerations made at an international level for how you then rehabilitate victims of sexual violence in the context of armed conflict. And that is led by primarily by UN agencies and indeed by UN missions, if there is a UN mission. But I would also put to you as well that in addition to rehabilitation of victims, there's also this idea about achieving justice, justice for victims, and that may be through some sort of truth commission or the like, or indeed through international criminal or domestic criminal means. And I would say that in that respect, we could do a lot better. I think that the access to justice is a significant issue for survivors of sexual violence in the context of armed conflict. Indeed, the survivors of sexual violence broadly, and then certainly in the context of armed conflict, access to justice becomes even more problematic. And that can be to do with issues in terms of collecting evidence, investigations, and so on and the like, and the time delta between when the actual criminal act occurred and when it's present day, and the fact that there is no physical evidence left and there is perhaps only circumstantial evidence, and then being able to establish that to a significant burden of proof, it creates problems in itself. What is interesting in this context, and I know I've kind of taken a little bit of a tangent, Ulla, but please forgive me for that, is actually to mention the fact that, in the context of, say, the international military tribunals for Nuremberg and the international military tribunals in Tokyo post the Second World War, not one single person was brought up for any charges to do with the use of sexual violence in the context of armed conflict, albeit that it's probably well accepted, certainly in the context of the war in the Pacific, that sexual violence was indeed perpetrated against a number of Koreans, Chinese, and other nations in which the Japanese invaded. But no one faced any military tribunal at the end of that war, in terms of the international military tribunals for charges of sexual violence. And indeed, it was not really until you then the international community advances towards the conflict in Rwanda and then the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. Is there then cases that come before courts that look at achieving justice for survivors of sexual violence in the context of armed conflict. And probably the seminal case there is probably the Akiescu case from the ICTR, where it then talks about it's the first time in which someone's found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity for the perpetration of sexual violence in the context of a conflict. John Paul Akiescu. And so, that's an issue as well. But if I then circle back now to then talking about how you rehabilitate victims, it certainly is a multi-generational problem. And look, I don't have experience necessarily in rehabilitation of victims. That is in itself a very niche field, and so I don't want to do them disservice to really sort of offer any sort of opinion on how that's done, because I don't have the expertise to know how that's done. But what I would say is that, or what I do have the expertise in knowing is that it is a multi-generational impact. It is felt by the survivors themselves, their families, and their communities, and it does take a significant period of time which to deal with the fallout of the use of sexual violence in armed conflict, and indeed. Just to get back to what is a normal situation post an armed conflict in any case. So in terms of how that's done, it's done on a case-by-case basis, based upon a conflict, based upon negotiations with warring parties. But one thing I would offer is that and there's been some commentary about, for example, the peace process at the moment in Afghanistan, and that is the absence of the female voice within those peace processes. And we could be doing a lot better on that topic as well. I think if we look to the negotiation of a peace arrangement between the United States and the Taliban, or now between the Afghan government and the Taliban, there are indeed calls from human rights advocates and advocates for WPS to say that voices of Afghan women are being lost in these particular negotiations. We need to be doing better about that. And that's just one example of where we could be doing better. There are many examples of that. But in terms of then of how that's done, that's beyond the scope of my expertise. Okay, question here. How during your under the mandates of international law and in criminal tribunals for international court where sexual violence in armed conflict has been prosecuted, and are these crimes recognised under the umbrella of war crimes or addressed on their own? Okay, so that particular question, I guess I kind of answered that in what I was speaking or answering the question that I received from Ulla, where I mentioned the Akiescu case for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. That's Jean Paul Akiescu, where he is found guilty. And indeed, when you're talking about, and there have been other cases where issues of sexual violence have been prosecuted and have come up. What I will do as well is, if you're interested in that, is I'll provide Muriel with a list of some of those cases and links to where those cases can be found, and perhaps then as well she can put those up onto the Facebook page as well, so that we don't delve too much into the law. But effectively, yes, indeed, in that context, the ICTR and the ICTY that have most dealt with issues of sexual violence. Although I would also say now that the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court does indeed criminalise acts of sexual violence, rape, sexual slavery, sexual assaults, and so on and so forth, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilisation, and so on, as crimes against humanity, war crime, and indeed as constituent crimes for the crime of genocide. So it really depends then, without wanting to delve too much again into getting into a legal discussion here, it really depends upon sort of the elements of the crime or the crime, break that down. But effectively, for a war crime to be proved, you also got to have a nexus to an armed conflict. You don't have to have that for a crime against humanity, but there are other proofs for a crime against humanity. But broadly, I would say that they do come under the umbrella of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and constituent crimes to the crime of genocide. And they have indeed been prosecuted. But I would say that those in international courts, but I would say that those prosecutions are few and far between. But that said, international courts and the ICC, they have limited resources. They step in when a state jurisdiction is either unwilling or unable to actually prosecute those crimes. And so, in that respect, sometimes there is strategic litigation by the ICC in particular. Okay, the question I have is just a small comment. Okay, not a question, just a small comment on women being the perpetrators. Sexual abuse can take many different forms. As an example, look up Remember Abu Ghraib, where women were prominently featured in the photos that were absolutely. So the Abu Ghraib is a great example there of where indeed women were linked to the perpetration of crimes of sexual violence, particularly when you're talking about stripping naked male prisoners, forcing them to get on their hands and knees to be able to wear dog collars and to actually perform sexual acts against each other. As perpetrators there, yes, indeed, you are correct. Abu Ghraib is a good example of that in the context of a more modern conflict. Okay, and I've had a comment from a colleague, Karine, and she's noted there that the ICTR, there was the Paulina Namashkiro case where a woman minister of a family and was prosecuted for rape. Okay. Thank you for that, Karine. Okay, another question here from Muriel. What role does religion play in committing, justifying, or preventing sexual violence? What relations does exist in religious groups who do not use sexual violence as a weapon and those who don't? I think I understand the question, but I also think I'm not qualified to answer the question. I'm not an expert in religion. I'm certainly not an expert in particular religious groups that frown upon sexual violence versus those that be more likely to use them. All I can probably talk about from my perspective is how indeed armed groups and terrorist groups often pervert their concept of religion in order to be able to perpetrate or justify acts of sexual violence. And that's probably my observation that I would make in that respect. I'm not going to say that the individuals that are doing so are actually representative of religion. What I would say is that they pervert that religion to their own means in order to justify the dehumanisation of individuals and in order to be able to then target people for sexual violence. So in the case of Daesh is a great example, again, looking at the way in particular Yazidi peoples, and in particular Yazidi women, and they did so because their version of or their interpretation of a religion said that these particular infidels were particularly egregious, and therefore they would target them, and they despised them. But that's about dehumanising an enemy, and it doesn't necessarily just take religion to dehumanise an enemy. The actual violence in general can be a dehumanising factor in some armed conflicts. Other violations of international humanitarian law, in particular Geneva Convention violations, acts of war crimes, declaring that you won't take people surrendering forth, and also being ways in which is a dehumanised. So the dehumanisation of people, I guess, points back to is more of an issue of, I guess, of mix and an idea that that if you are able to dehumanise the enemy, you are then more easily able to justify the means in which you are going to use to bring about their partial or total destruction. And also justify to comply with regional law and concepts of proportionality and military necessity when it comes to targeting legitimate targets, let alone justifying targeting civilians who are humanitarian workers or those others who are absolutely provided protection under international law and who are never targetable. Okay, I guess I'm just looking here. I think I've answered all the questions that have been asked thus far, and we're running good for time. Look, I'm happy to take any other questions that may come up. So do you think, Muriel, it might be worth just waiting a minute or two to see if anyone is typing or wants to type anything further before we close things out? Martine, great. Yeah, okay. The question from Martine's asked is, does gender violence as a strategy in war occur evenly around the world, or are there places where it happens more or less? And what are the reasons behind it? Maybe different historical backgrounds of using it as a strategy. Look, I can only speak from my experience and my observation here, not necessarily based on quantitative data. But what I would say is that we find is that when it comes to non-international armed conflict, so armed conflict is either of an international character or of a non-international character. What we see in terms of non-international armed conflict, from my experience, where there seems to be a more or greater likelihood that sexual violence will be utilised as a strategy of warfare conflict. In an international armed conflict, when there is two identified states fighting each other, the rules around IHL are fairly well regulated. There are acts of sexual violence perpetrated in the context of conflict and indeed concentrated sexual violence acts. But I think when you introduce the presence of a civilian population and seek to start targeting non-state actors, and the lines blur between what is a non-state actor participating in a conflict and what is a non-state actor not participating, and so on, then you see greater instances of the use of sexual violence in armed conflict. And I would say that is there one place in the world that is more likely for it to happen? I'd say no. I would say it's been seen in the Balkans, it's been seen in Rwanda, it's been seen in South Sudan, in Sudan, in DRC, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq. It's been seen in Myanmar. So it's been seen in Colombia. So I would say that what I would put to you is that wherever you find armed conflict, you will find issues of sexual violence in the context of conflict, either as a direct strategy of war or the result of a breakdown in society, or society, or as a result as a result of a breakdown in public order, or alternatively used by arms groups. So I don't think it's I think it would be interesting to and there probably is some research into this, but I'm not familiar with it, and so again I wouldn't want to speak out of turn and make assumptions about things. But in terms of some of the conflicts that I have seen, there are certainly historical backgrounds that influence the use of sexual violence as well. So in the context of South Sudan, for example, sexual violence is a challenge that society is facing more broadly, not just in the context of that conflict. issues of gender-based violence and in particular violence against women in societies will obviously translate across to acts of sexual violence in the context of armed conflict. And so in the context of South Sudan, I certainly saw cultural practices like cattle raiding create feuds amongst clans, clan fighting, the taking of bushwives, and I guess a toxic masculine society that suggested that the particular place of women was subservient to men, and that men who were powerful and therefore by proclamation had weapons could do what they liked. My impression, of course, but that creates the rife, or that is the breeding ground, in my opinion, for such issues. Yeah, I can't honestly say that I can put my hand on my heart and be able to tell you that there are places in the world where it's more likely to happen. I think in that context there, wherever you see armed conflict occur, you will see sexual violence, and that makes it all the more important that we address these issues, that we talk about these issues, that we understand the objectives and the end goals of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. That we integrate a gender perspective, that we look to ultimately gender equality as a means to address these issues as well. So, because these issues, in my mind, when it comes to the use of sexual violence, the greater levels of gender inequality you see within society, I would say there is a correlation between lack of gender equality and issues of sexual violence, in particular in the context of conflict. So I guess that's where you draw some correlation to then try and look at, therefore, where it might be more likely to occur than other occasions. Okay, next question is from Martine as well. To what extent were you briefed on what sexual misconduct like? Was there a procedure for letting your superiors know about instances of sexual violence perpetrated against civilians by others? Yeah, absolutely, Martine. In terms of in a military chain of command, the first thing you know is that there absolutely is a reporting mechanism in place to identify sexual misconduct that you suspect colleagues to be involved in, and also there is a reporting procedure to report sexual violence that is perpetrated against civilians. So in that context there, in a military organisation, that'll be covered by the military regulations that apply to a particular, that either apply broadly or alternatively that apply to, and indeed they're also covered by, if you're working as part of a NATO or indeed as part of a UN peacekeeping force, they will also be grouped up in directions provided by those relevant organisations. And they will link to quickly to report the incidents, what information is required, to whom the report is sent to whom the report is for information for, who has action then to take the task as a task to move forward to investigate, and so on and so forth. So in my experience, that's a pretty robust system, particularly because in my experience, military commanders identify that sexual misconduct from within their own forces, and I'm speaking now about my own experience in my own military force, but also in the context of NATO operations and coalition operations and UN operations. People recognise up and down the chain of command that the use of sexual misconduct or the use of sexual violence will undermine the policy and the authority in which you operate in a country. So, particularly if your forces are perpetrating those acts of sexual violence, you will very quickly have the good work that you've been doing undone by such actions. And so, in that context, commanders up and down the chain of command are pretty alive and pretty aware of that. And indeed, and certainly my experience has been to work mostly with the US military, the Canadians, the British, the Kiwis, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Danes, and so on, and obviously the Australians. And in that context, there certainly those militaries as well have robust systems in place. They're not perfect, but they certainly have the reporting mechanisms in place. Then I guess the second part of that question is, not only is there the idea that you're briefed on it, and are the mechanisms in place, but there's also, do you trust the mechanisms, and does the chain of command engender a culture in which those things are to be reported? And that's the second component of that. And in my experience, again, there has always been a culture of being able to address those things head on. There has always been a culture of being open and transparent about that, because of if insofar as being pragmatic about if you address those things head on, then it can have impacts on your ability to be able to achieve your mission and the operational effects you can achieve. That said, also there's a growing understanding that from within, certainly the Australian Defence Force is well attuned to this, and as is a number of other military organisations, that the issue of sexual violence, sexual misconduct, is an issue that not only undermines their standing in terms of how they operate in an operational theatre with the people they're interacting with there, the civilian population primarily, but also obviously the nation in which you represent, the people that you're representing, you'll impact your reputation with them. But it also as well has an impact on the ability for us to be able to achieve the gender equality that we set out in terms of our military organisation. There's been issues of sexual misconduct that occurred in many militaries, and certainly the Australian Defence Force is one where sexual misconduct has occurred, and in that context, one of the you go about an organisation, you go about investigating it, instituting a organisational change, and then you also go about understanding what impact does that have on actually our ability to be able to achieve the goals that we set ourselves, in terms of being able to encourage women to want to join our organisation, to want to be involved in our organisation. It impacts that too, and that's about the ultimate goal of achieving gender equality, and it's also about achieving operational effects, because we need to be able to recruit women to be able to have them as part of our gender balanced force when we deploy to locations where we then need to be able to rely upon the insights that women have to a particular situation, or also just to be able to utilise them based upon cultural norms maybe required in a location.
So if there's no one who's just raising their hand right now, then I would say there is no more questions.
In which case, I just wanted to thank everyone who came today, and who obviously in these extraordinary times joining us by Zoom is kind of a good bit of fun. Although it's I always prefer to have people in person, because you can sort of get a bit more to and fro and feedback. But I'm hopefully that people have taken something away from the presentation today. Clearly, this is an introductory presentation. It's not aimed to deeply into issues, but what it was ultimately about is about making you aware of the use of sexual violence in the context of armed conflicts, the manner in which sexual violence is used, perhaps some motivations as to why it's used, certainly an understanding of who it's used by, and how it links to strategies, or how it links to break in society, but also importantly to draw out how a gender perspective and the Women, Peace and Security agenda looks to our understanding of armed conflict broadly, but also with respect to issues of sexual violence in the context of armed conflict. And you can take those same analogies and broaden them out to more to greater issues of gender-based violence. and indeed to look at then how that impacts on individuals' rights and the way in which individuals, societies, and communities are impacted by such actions. And again, I'll just implore everyone who is a student, particularly of international relations, human rights, peace and conflict studies, or the law, to get familiar with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, to get stuck into understanding what the resolutions are about, but also to read up about how those resolutions are being put into practice within their own countries through national action plans, because this is really a cross-cutting agenda that hits across so many of the UN agencies, so many of the various agendas that UN agencies run, and certainly the Sustainable Development Goals. So in that respect there, it's not something that's going away. It is indeed the manner in which we're driving towards gender equality. We still have a ways to go, but we need passionate young minds to be excited about it, to get involved with it, and to be able to carry it forward. So thank you very much for coming and listening to to me speak about these particular issues.
Thank you very much for giving the lecture and taking the time again to come and talk to us. I'm very, very thankful for that, so that we can try to keep on going the work and just keep people informed about these issues during those kind of weird times too. So thank you very much for taking the time. Again, it was very, very nice.
You're welcome.